Good evening, everyone, and welcome once again to the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University. We're pleased to see so many Brown students, faculty, alumni, and other interested people joining us tonight. I am Richard Arenberg, visiting professor of the practice of political science and a senior fellow at the Watson Institute. I'm honored to serve this year as the interim director of the Taubman Center, which is a part of the Watson Institute. The Taubman Center seeks to impact American politics and policy through scholarship, public opinion polling, conferences, workshops, academic research, internships, and a robust series of speakers drawn from experts, the media, academia, think tanks, and public officials. Tonight, we present the 24th in this year's series of programs. And tonight, we're very honored to be joined by my colleague and one of Brown University's most popular professors, James Morone. He is the John Hazen White Professor of Political Science and Public Policy here at Brown. And every biography of Jim I could find began with, quote, "I grew up in Rio de Janeiro." So I'll start there. Jim grew up in Rio and moved to New York when he was 9. He holds an undergraduate degree from Middlebury College and a PhD from the University of Chicago. He is the author of 11 books. His first book, The Democratic Wish, was named a notable book of 1991 by the New York Times and won the American Political Science Association's Gladys Kemmerer Award for the best book on U.S. national policy. His Hellfire Nation, The Politics of Sin in American History, was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize and named a top book of 2003 by numerous newspapers and magazines. His The Heart of Power, Health and Politics in the Oval Office, co-authored with David Blumenthal, was featured on the cover of the New York Times Book Review. According to unreliable sources, President Obama was seen reading his book at Camp David. Jim's most recent book, the widely acclaimed Republic of Wrath, How American Politics Turned Tribal from George Washington to Donald Trump, he will discuss tonight. He is a former chair of the Brown University faculty, and has served as chair of the Political Science Department and the Public Policy Program. Jim is most proud of having been 5 times awarded the Hazeltine Citation, voted annually by seniors at Brown for the professor that most inspired them. He has served as a visiting professor at Yale, the University of Chicago, the University of Bremen in Germany, and at Oxford University, where he visits regularly. But perhaps most impressively, Jim is a Taubman affiliate and a former director of the Taubman Center. My conversation with Jim tonight will last approximately until 8 o'clock, after which we will take questions from the audience. You may enter questions through the Q&A box on Zoom, which will be viewable to me. You may begin entering questions if you have them already, beginning now and throughout the program. Please keep them short and to the point. We will convey as many of these questions to Jim as we have time for. This event is being recorded for later viewing, available on the Taubman Center website or the Watson Institute website. It is also being live streamed on YouTube. So now it's a very great honor for me to introduce Professor James Morone, and welcome, Jim.
Thanks, Rich. It's really wonderful to be here on our home court here at Brown. And I just wish we were in a room with people and that I could actually see my wonderful students and friends and so forth. But looking forward to that.
That's why I say I'm glad to see so many of them here tonight, even though I can't see them.
I noticed that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, your book sweeps through American history from George Washington to Donald Trump. It focuses a lot on the ugliness of our politics. What's the most important thing that you want the reader to come away with?
Yeah. So a great opening question, of course, as always from Rich. You know, I started this book because I wanted to know, is anything different? Our politics have gotten so angry. You know, now it's 6 or 7 out of 10 Democrat parents who would be really upset if their child married a Republican and vice versa. And I just thought, you know, that is not something that I've known in my lifetime. So this intense partisanship, what's new and what's really the same old thing? If you go back through American history, I thought, you know, maybe we should just take a chill pill and calm down. And so the first thing that struck me was there's some things that aren't really that new. Like most people will tell you, you know, media is really different. The media is really different, but the idea of very biased media is not dramatically different. The media in the election way back in 1800 was remarkably biased. You know, Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams, if you read one or the other newspapers, the Federalist or the Democratic Republican newspapers, they would paint a vicious portrait of the other side. Or to take a more dramatic example that's been lost in history, I was surprised to find, after the Civil War, there was incredible violence throughout the South. In Louisiana alone, just in 1868, there were over 800 murders of African Americans, mainly leaders of their communities, that were documented in a report. That's just in 1 year. What was really striking to me is if you read the Republican newspapers, the outrages were described in complete detail with real fervor. The Democratic newspapers over and over again simply dismissed the violence. There was real violence happening, and they either dismissed it as just political rhetoric, fake news of the era, or actually blamed the Black people who were being killed as being thieves or whatever. So media alone, yes, it's changed, but if you think, oh, the media is pretty biased now, that's not new. Nor is violence. You know, between 1830 and 1860, we had about 70 fistfights on the floor of Congress. We had duels. One guy said, one senator said, Hammond said, those who are not carrying a knife and a gun on the floor of the Senate are carrying 2 guns, 2 pistols. So that's not new. What is different? And here, finally, I'm getting to my answer. You asked one question, Rich, and I've gotten us almost to the end of the show. But let me get to the meat of what I found that I really wasn't expecting at all. If you look at American history, there are 2 fiery issues. There are fiery issues all the way back. One, of course, race. A country built with a slave line running through its constitution, followed by violence, followed by Jim Crow, followed by segregation. That's a huge, you cannot underestimate the intensity and the violence of the race line. Second, immigration. We've always been a country of immigration, and the battles over the immigrants have been ferocious. But here's the thing that I wasn't expecting to find. Right back to 1800, you had basically the Democrats being the party of white supremacy. They were the Democratic Republicans, later the Democrats. They, oh, here's my cat coming to hear what all the excitement is. I'll just put her here. If you're allergic to cats, I really apologize. If not, here she is. If you were a Democratic Republican, you were part of the party of slavery, and this was true right through the night to the 19th, from 1800 to the 1930s. But that same party, the Democrats, were very open to immigrants. They were giving immigrants the ballot when they hadn't recovered from the sea voyage yet. So here was a party very benighted, even by the standards of the day, about race, but very open about immigration. Go over to the Conservative Party, the Federalists, later the Whigs, later the Republicans. They were, by the standards of the day, remarkably open about race. The Adams administration, which was horrible towards the immigrants, actually made a treaty with the slave rebels in Haiti, then known as Saint-Domingue. So a very a progressive, by the standards of the day, party about race. But man, they were nasty about immigrants. And that went on through American history. One party reached out to one group on the edges of power and pushed out another group. And the other party had different groups, one for race, one for immigration. I should add there's a third line through that, and that's sexuality and gender. Any apartheid society, any society worried about keeping us separated from them, always puts strict limits on women. But let me put that aside for now. This is a little more complicated. So we have between 1800 and the 1930s, basically a situation where the parties diffused the two great culture wars, mainly because they split. Republicans were open towards African Americans, closed towards immigrants. The Democrats were just the reverse. People who are used to today's Democratic Party can't get used to that. Really? Democrats were the party of white supremacy? Yes, they were. They were completely the party of white supremacy. Then in the 1930s, something began to change, and the change accelerated through the 20th century. First, African Americans did something incredibly bold. They joined the party of segregation. In 1932, the Great Migration takes African Americans to the cities, and the city machines, the politicians, come to them and say, hey, come join the Democratic Party. And about a quarter of the Black districts vote Democratic for the first time in 1932. There had been 23 African Americans elected to Congress. Every one of them a Republican. In 1932, that begins to crack. In 1936, a majority of Black districts go for the Democrats. Newspapers laughed at the African Americans. They called them fools. They said, don't these fools realize this is the party of segregation? This is a party run by white supremacists in the South. Why are they voting for them? And the great and remarkable story about the 1930s was that, about the New Deal era, was that the African American Northern voters went from a minority in their party in 1936 to, by 1948, they'd won the party and helped push through a civil rights plank. And it was the white supremacists who walked out in protest of the 1948 convention. So by 1948, African Americans are a solid part of the Democratic Party. And then little by little, the immigrants joined the same party. The last group to join were Asian Americans. People don't know that in 1996, Asian Americans went for Bob Dole. Almost no one went for Bob Dole running against Bill Clinton. Asian Americans did. But after 2000, the Republicans lost them too. So the Republicans lost African Americans. They lost Latinx. They lost Asian Americans. They lost women. And so what we had by 2000, 2010 was a party of all the so-called minorities on one side, and a story I also tell in the book, how the Republican Party became white. From 1968 to 2020, only 39% on average of white voters voted for the white presidential candidate. So the first time in American history, the great culture war, race, immigration, nativism was completely transformed into politics by the political parties. One party was now the party of all the so-called minorities. The other party became the white people's party. And if you were someone who felt nativist, who felt racial anxiety, you were a member of the Republican Party. This became abundantly clear, dramatically clear in the Obama era, and then, of course, in the Trump era. Trump's strategy was to squeeze yet more of those anxious white votes into the Republican Party. So the great find, and of course there's other things I found in the book that I wasn't expecting, but the thing that I found that was most surprising to me and most dramatic was that the parties had always diffused their great cultural conflicts. And I've simplified a little bit the way I've just told the story in the last 5 minutes. You can pick any year, it gets a little more complicated, but it's always diffused by the parties. And that starting in the 2000s, and particularly by the Obama years, they're really different tribes. They're people who look different from one another. So both parties could look at the other and say, oh my God, that's not our America. And they could honestly say that that's how the parties felt. So that, I think, there's lots of reasons the parties are angry at one another, and there's lots of reasons for our tribal politics, but the true gathering of tribes, African Americans and all immigrant groups on one side, and white and anxious white voters, 50% of Republicans now scale pretty high on the racial anxiety scales. That leaves 50%, of course, who don't, including many who are listening to us tonight. Talk about that later, but that great divide, minorities, so-called minorities, people who identify as minorities on the one hand, and people who identify themselves as white on the other, give a particularly intensity to our politics. And I think how American politics turned tribal, I think that's the most powerful single piece of it. There are others, Rich, and we'll get to them, but that's the most powerful. Let me just make one more point, Rich, and then I'll let you get another question in edgewise. And that's this. The other thing that you really see studying American politics, you really see studying history, and this will give some comfort to people who are depressed about politics today. Man, things change. They just keep changing. So I just give an example to my students. My students are going to be sick of hearing this, but that if you were to take a time machine back to an election you and I will remember well, Rich, but not everybody in the audience will, the 1988 election between Michael Dukakis and George Herbert Walker Bush. Going into the election, Mike Dukakis knew for a fact he was going to win West Virginia, because West Virginia always voted Democratic. And on the other side, the Republican people running the Bush campaign knew for a fact they were going to win California and Vermont, because Republicans always won California and Vermont. Indeed, in the last 9 elections, presidential elections, California had gone Republican 8 times. Now think of it, California Republican, West Virginia Democrat, not Vermont Republican, not anymore. And so every 10 years, you look back at where we were 10 years ago and you say, oh my heavens, how things have changed. But because we live month to month and midterm election to midterm election, we tend to miss that. So just try to imagine current trends and project them out 10 years. And I promise you, it's going to look very different. So I'm sure we'll get some questions about the 2020 election, but already we're seeing new trends developing that could project us out very differently for both Republicans and Democrats. Just mentioned one thing about that. Georgia, Democratic presidential vote and 2 Democratic senators. Hey, I wrote a textbook and I thought, well, I'm comfortable making this prediction. So we went to print saying the Senate was 52-48 Republican. Wow. And when one of the editors said, are you sure? Because we got those 2 special elections. I said, trust me, I'm a political scientist. No way the Democrats are going to win 2 Senate seats in Georgia in a special election. Ain't going to happen. Things are changing.
Well, it's interesting. I want to go back to for a minute to where you started. You sort of describing this reordering of the 2 parties, particularly in terms of immigration and racism, and it was a fascinating to trace that through the book. But I found myself wondering about the implications of this. And I don't mean to sound partisan myself, but I really want to ask you, one of these parties planted their flag on the wrong side of history.
Yeah. Possibly, if you're, yeah. Okay. You go back to the 1964 election, and I'm alert to the reality that some of our students, Rich, are Republicans.
Sure.
And I want to give them something hopeful to think about and talk about. So you go back to the 1964 election. That was an election where the Republicans became the current party that the Republicans are. They saw that the passage of the Civil Rights Bill left them a possible coalition. The Northern, very conservative Republicans and the Southern Democrats. And Barry Goldwater ran a campaign. He was a genuinely honest, free market a conservative Republican. He was famously not biased. There's a great story that I saw in Time magazine from 1964 during the campaign when they were describing Goldwater as not a bigot. And despite the fact that he voted against the Civil Rights Act. And the story they told was that a Black teacher, a Black principal from an African-American school in Arizona came to Goldwater and said, look, your family donates a watch to the white school, but you don't donate a watch to the top grade getter in the Black school. And Goldwater said, yeah, that's because I'm against segregation. And the principal said, well, segregation is as much the white school as the Black school. And Goldwater said, damn it, you are right. And from that day on, he gave a gold watch to both schools, always giving a little lecture against segregation. So no rap on Goldwater. He was a genuine conservative. But he knew that his election was predicated on the idea that he swept the segregationist, angry South in the middle of the Civil Rights campaign, in the middle of the Birmingham battles, violence. He needed to get the angry white segregationists into the Republican Party. And so he said nothing. Northern liberals like George Romney wrote him very angry letters that are in the archives saying, you said nothing while racists ran the party. In that 64 convention, there were African-American delegates like Jackie Robinson, the famous baseball player, who just said, and put this on the front pages of the Black press, like the Chicago Defender, he said, being at the Republican convention, he'd been a lifelong Republican, being at the Republican convention made me feel like a Jew in Nazi Germany. That's how much hostility I felt all around me. So what Goldwater and after him Nixon did was that they both espoused very conservative libertarian market principles on the one hand, and on the other hand, they turned a blind eye to the ardent segregationists, to the pure racists that crawled into their coalition. And between 1968 and today, 64, 68, 72, and today, the Republican Party accepted this toxic marriage. And, you know, they didn't have to do much for it. They had a little wink now and then. So, you know, liberals like us are always finding, you know, this or that little coded wink and nod and dog whistle, we call it. But they didn't have to dog whistle very much. The entire white South was voting for the Republican Party. And the genuine, honest conservatives were also voting. And they didn't have to see each other even. It was like being on Zoom, sort of. And the problem was, as the white vote diminished, and it falls, self-identified whites, it falls by about 2% every presidential election. As it diminished, winks and dog whistles weren't enough. It had to get louder and get louder. And Trump understood this. What he understood in 2016 was, good heavens, we're really down. When Reagan ran, it was 90% white. He didn't have to do dog whistles. The white vote was going to come his way. But once it gets down to the 60%, then you really need to get that last white vote. So it's not that the Republican Party changed. It's that rump became more and more, the toxic rump became more and more important to it. And so Trump sort of peeled off the veneer and just began to scream, white power, white privilege, bad boys stand by, etc. Proud boys stand by. He was just bare knuckle about it. Which brings us to the current place of the Republican Party. They really have a choice. Remember what I said, things are always changing. And the Republican Party has a fundamental fork in the road that it is facing right now. If it stays with the Trump party, 2% fewer white, self-identified white voters every election, that is, as you said, planting your flag on a doomed coalition. Just can't win. But the Republicans once had African-American votes. They once had 45% of the Latinx votes. They once had a majority of the Asian votes. Now, of course, it mixed. They had, if you look at the different nationalities, there were different percentages, but nevertheless, they were doing pretty well. So the fork in the road for the Republicans, this is what I tell my Republican students all the time, is there is genuine conservative sentiment in all parts of the country. What the Republicans need to do to wash away their Trumpism is to stand up and say, no, we are really serious about developing a large constituency of African Americans, of Asian Americans, of Latinx voters. And as they do that, pushing aside the white supremacy, white privilege people, and building a party on genuine conservative principles. But as long as Trump is in the picture, that's going to be hard to do. But when I think of the young people in my classes, they're not many because we're at Brown, but when I think of the young people in my classes who are serious Republicans, and there's always a few sitting in the corner hoping that, you know, the professor doesn't bash them and the students don't bash them. And I just think they are the future of the Republican Party. And you can't run the system with just one party. You know that, Rich. You've written a book, a really good book on the filibuster that basically says to run the Senate, you need two parties. So our future is really in the hands, to some extent, of young Republicans who stand up and say, you know, our grandfather's Fox News, turn it off. We need to build a new coalition on conservative principles that will go to the Black churches and say, look, on social issues, you and us are really, we're agreed. Let's build a new kind of coalition. Because if they fail, if you young Republicans fail, we're in really deep trouble because we can't run a party. We can't run a country where one party has become so viciously, so vicious about the cultural issues. We need two strong parties. I'll make fun of the Democrats in just a minute. So you Republicans out there, don't worry. There's lots of criticism to make on both sides. But the Trump party really does frighten me. And I think that's a place where, Rich, you're right. That is just a short-term, that is just a sort of quick high that cannot survive very much longer as America's basic demographics change. So he's made people fearful of demographics. I have a story in the book. The last thing I'll say on this, a story in the book where I do all my writing in an old country house in New Hampshire, and I go to the dump. You know, it's what you do. There's no garbage collection. You get your trash and you go to the dump. And I remember during the Obama presidency, two guys sitting around, they were really upset. And they said, if Obama gets away with opening immigration, we're going to lose this whole country. We're just going to lose the country. They had this image of immigrants sweeping away their idea of the Republican Party. And I wanted to engage them, but they were so angry that I thought, okay, I mean, usually you could just walk and talk to people at the dump. And usually they used to make fun of me for being a pointy-head liberal and would get along. But now the fear that they were feeling, and I just thought, that's a kind of toxic feeling. This just fear that their country was being washed away by elites that looked different from them. And I think the task for the Republican Party is to get them focused less on, oh my God, immigrants, oh my heavens, African Americans, and more on why do we want to be conservatives in a policy direction, not a tribal direction. So again, a long answer to your question, Rich, but it's one that really goes through my book and I think really echoes through American history.
Yeah, no, great answer. As you mentioned, Barry Goldwater, it made me think about, we're talking about this sorting of the parties and how they've become increasingly polarized, really, from the point that you're describing, really, I think starting with the Voting Rights Act of 65, 65, I mean.
Yeah.
And Goldwater is sort of emblematic of how much things have changed in that regard in the Senate. Because here he was, when I got there in the late 70s, 74, he was probably the most conservative member of the Senate, one or two or three, but he was quite reliably someone who would work across the aisle with Democrats. And in that period of time, if you looked at the population of moderates in the Senate, there were you could name probably 40 to 45 of them split, among the two parties. So the parties were incredibly heterogeneous, and in some ways maybe even too similar to each other. Political scientists at the time, some of them were wringing their hands and saying, gee, this is not good for democracy because the parties are not offering a choice. We used to hear about, Wallace used to talk about Tweedledee and Tweedledum, the two parties, Yeah. So it made me think about how far this has come, and now the parties are much more homogenous, and as a result, they select much more aggressive leadership, and they move further and further away from each other.
Yeah, never listened to political scientists, but the political science profession came out with a report, a presidential report, saying we need more partisanship. Be careful what you wish for. Yeah. But it's true, as you say, just two comments on what you said. One is, if you went back to that era, if you went back to 1965, 64, the 60s, and Goldwater is there, the Republicans are split between really conservative John Birchers, particularly in the Midwest, and the liberal Republicans who are fighting for the black vote in the northern cities. So you had a party where the two sides within the party despised each other. And meanwhile, the Democratic Party has a large civil rights contingent in the North and Southern segregationists in the South. So both parties had arch conservatives and arch liberals, if there's such a word. And what Goldwater's people, and then really Nixon, managed to do was to realize, if we could make a coalition of the Northern conservative Republicans and the Southern conservative Democrats, we would have a majority party. And then the people who fought this hardest were the Northern Republican liberals, that after all, the Civil Rights Act would not have passed without, and you'll remember this, Rich, Everett Dirksen, who was the majority leader of the Republicans. He took that bill and he wrote in 60 or 70 changes. The New York Times called it Ev Dirksen's bill. They used to say about Ev Dirksen, Mr. Dirksen, could you be considered loquacious in 1,000 words or less, please? He loved to talk, but he was one of the Northern liberals. And so what we've got today is the two parties have aligned, right? conservative Northerners and conservative Southerners coalesced into the Republican Party, and likewise the Democratic Party. Let me just say one more thing, Rich, that was implicit in what you just said a second ago, and that is the Voting Rights Act and why we needed a Voting Rights Act. What amazed me most, second most about all this, I wasn't expecting the Democrats to be the party of white supremacy so consistently, but the thing that kind of shocked me when I started looking at American history, back to the election, let's go back to the election of 1800, first contested election, Adams versus Jefferson. There are 16 states, and 7 of them changed the election rules during the election. I couldn't believe it. They were all changing the rules. There's Jefferson running, and he writes a letter to James Monroe, governor of Virginia, and he says, you know, James, I've always been for voting by district for the electors for president, because of course I'm Mr. Democracy. I think we should be closer to the people. But I just realized I'm going to lose an elector in Virginia if we do it that way. Let's go to winner take all. So he took his principles, threw them out the window, and changed the rules during the election. And I thought, well, that's weird. And then you go back to the Constitution. It's got nothing to say about parties, because they hated parties. Thinking about Jefferson, he said, if I could not go to heaven but with a party, I would not go there at all. I'd rather burn in hell than join a party, which is kind of funny for the guy who started the Democratic Party, but never mind that. So the Constitutional Convention and the founders, Jefferson wasn't at the convention, of course, and the founders hated parties and said nothing about who was going to vote. They just tossed it to the states. Who's going to vote for the House of Representatives? Who's going to vote for the electors for president? Let the states decide. The time, place, manner, that's for the states to decide. And the states, from the very, very beginning, made it a political football. As I said, 7 out of 16 states changed the rules during the election campaign. In New York, the Federalists won, then they lost, and they sort of had one set of rules when they won. When they lost the legislature, they then tried to change the rules again. And the Federalist governor, John Jay, said, no, you can't keep changing the rules. So he put a limit to this. But that rules stayed up for play. And that, when I watched American politics, it's not just something that Trump introduced. It's that we have no bedrock rules about how to vote. We have 50 different systems in 50 different states, and every 4 years, every 2 years, up for grabs again. And it's kind of shocking. So before every election, we have a fight about all the ways we're going to run the election. This election really put that under the spotlight, but that's always been true. And if there's one thing we really have to change, you read American history, is the amount of cheating that went on, legal cheating, where people simply say, as Jefferson did in the election of 1800, hey, let's change the rules to advantage our side. And here is the second. So no rules, it's up for grabs. It's a couple of political scientists that I like say it's like Calvin ball. Those of you who are fans of Calvin and Hobbes, not John Calvin, you scholars, I'm talking about Calvin and Hobbes. You may remember Calvin had Calvin ball, where he'd run around with the ball and he'd just keep making up the rules as he went along. Always, well, that's our political system. It's Calvin ball. You make up the rules as you go along. The reason, the dirty, rotten secret about American politics, and don't say this to an international audience or we'll lose the respect we have around the world for being the greatest democracy, is, I'm joking, is that there is no fundamental right built into the Constitution giving anybody a right to vote for anything. In Bush v. Gore, the majority said explicitly, the individual, I quote, the individual citizen has no constitutional right for the electors to vote for the electors of the President of the United States. Now, a state may grant the citizens a right, the Constitution does not, which Trump people read and said, hey, let's just change the rules. Unfortunately, they tried to change the rules after the game, which was proved difficult to do. But there is no right to, and I can hear you thinking, well, wait, what about the 17th Amendment? That gives everyone the right to vote for 2 senators, right? Your direct popular vote for senators. Nope. Go back and read the 17th Amendment. What it says, and I quote, the electors in each state, that is the citizens who get to vote, shall have the qualifications requisite for the electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. Translation, if you can vote for the state legislature, you can vote for your senators. What did that mean? That meant if you were an African-American in, say, North Carolina, sorry, we've got a set of rules that keep you from voting. Federal government's not going to mess with that, even when they're voting for a federal office. And women could vote in North Dakota at the time, but they couldn't vote in New York at the time. So what we've done again and again is toss it to the states. The states make up their own rules. And the big rock problem is there's no right to vote built into the Constitution. So I think if you want a cause, the cause is to say, look, let's change this. Let's assert and legislate an absolute right to vote and just say, hey, when you turn 18, let's not do a whole lot of rigmarole. It's like a gun. You can own a gun younger, but you've got a right. You got a right to own a gun, I take it, from some readings of the Second Amendment. Sorry, that should get some people asking questions. You should have a right to vote. Done. In fact, I've been promoting a requirement to vote on the theory that it is a larger violation of our common good if you stay home on election day than if you park illegally. And I would love for us to go to an Australian or Brazilian system. It's not like they're going to round you up and throw you in jail, but there ought to be an expectation that everyone votes. So I'm hoping that's something that the Reformed Republican Party and the Democratic Party can someday join hands on and say, you know what, let's have a constitutional amendment, nothing too crazy, just all citizens have a right to vote on their 18th birthday for every election, every office, federal and state, federal, state, and local, in the state where they reside. It is a amendment that came up that was going to be the 15th Amendment, but it only got 5 votes in the Senate back in 1869. The Republicans wanted to discriminate against Irish in the North, so they thought that'd be, and the Democrats wanted to discriminate against Chinese in California. If we say that, then those people might get to vote. And so they made a much more limited 15th Amendment, giving the former slaves a right to vote, but a very limited version that was later subverted. So that's our cause, everyone. Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, let's set a set of rules and stick by them and make a constitutionally mandated right to vote for everyone when they turn 18. You'd be surprised. It will help both parties become strong and robust and might save a democracy that right now I fear is really on the ropes.
You make a very, very strong case there. Very good point. I mean, I always thought of that as kind of one of the kind of quirks, the many quirks of when you get down into the weeds in terms of constitutional procedures and election procedures and legislative procedure, and it's just full of these sort of odd things that are kind of fun to talk to your class about, during the lecture. And I just thought of that as really kind of an oddity, but the experience, it seems to me, of the 2020 election has, I think, reminded us how deadly serious all of this is.
I really worry about where we are, Rich. I don't know if you agree with this, but I mean, the Trump people just were kind of slow out of the gate in trying to subvert the election.
Right.
But, there were a lot of Republicans who just did their job. And in Arizona, in Georgia, Ducey in Arizona, in Georgia, in Michigan. And these people, some very low-level people in the counties in Georgia, but now that the full national spotlight has been placed on them, their careers are probably over. And the idea that the message that's gone out to Republican office holders is you certify Democrats and you're dead. That is really a terrifying message.
And
Really makes me
in a
worry.
sense, I think the election hung by a thread in a sense, because it relied on individuals in a handful of states standing up and doing the right thing. And it's
Yeah,
not hard to imagine a circumstance in which that could have been different, like maybe if the election was a lot closer than it was.
yeah. My fear is that, people just did their jobs and they were bold about it. And they said, the Secretary of State in Georgia was very strong about this. She says, no, sir, you don't have the facts on your side. But now that the party has trained the spotlight on all those little places in the electoral process, in Michigan, you've got 4 people, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, who certify each election. And the idea that those low-level administrators who usually just stamp the election, and now what's going to happen 4 years from now when everybody looking at those 4 people? I really worry about what the political scientists call a multiple iteration game. We survived thanks to people just saying, well, I'm going to do my job. Don't be silly. The first iteration, but what happens in the next iteration when the party starts pounding them a year, 2 years before the first vote is cast? It reminds me a little bit of what happened after Brown versus Board of Education, where it was really touch and go how Southern officials were going to respond to this. And for 2 or 3 years, there were a lot of Southern officials who had bombast and said absolutely not. But it was really the Arkansas, Faubus in Arkansas, who stood up and said, I'm drawing a line. There's no way I'm going to segregate a school. You want to segregate a school? You send the paratroopers in here. And he got reelected for a 3rd term, which was unprecedented in Arkansas, by a record amount. And every deep South Southern governor saw that there was gold in that kind of rhetoric and that kind of resistance. And the resistance solidified. It took 3 or 4 years for the resistance to really solidify and become ferocious. And then after that, you had the George Wallace's standing in the school doorway, stopping African Americans from enrolling, because they knew that was the way to political success. And my huge fear is that we're at the same moment. Those people knew that wasn't the future, and they knew that was wrong. And once it no longer became electorally viable after the Voting Rights Act passed, they changed their colors. Wallace changed his colors. But for a while, they did just the most pernicious things just to get elected, because they saw where the electoral winds were blowing. And I think if the Trump Republican Party begins to punish people who do their electoral job, we're in for a really scary 4 to 8 to 12 years going forward. So that's another thing that I really worry about. And
I would add to that, if you look around the country at what red state legislatures are doing in terms of, as you talk about rigging elections, they're cutting closer to the bone, I think, than ever before.
Yeah, and it's crazy because you can't rig for 2 reasons. One is you'll never be able to rig your way to a majority, given the diversity of our country, without essentially destroying Republican values, without destroying small r, without destroying the democracy itself. The other thing, remember I said things keep changing. When I finished the book, it was clear all the so-called minorities, people who identify as minority on one side, people who identify as white on the other. But something pretty interesting happened in 2018 and 2020, and that is suburban whites, educated suburban whites. They're going to vote no matter what. they're coming to the Democratic Party. And all those limits on voting, I know my friends in rural New Hampshire, they're not likely voters the way the suburban people in Manchester and Concord are. Those are New Hampshire towns, for those of you in Rhode Island. So are the Republicans, even if you accept the basic priors of, okay, we're going to try to limit our own, limit the other party's voters, are they making it more difficult for their own party's voters? And do Democrats now actually prosper on higher election barriers, because the kinds of people who turn out in midterm elections, the educated suburban people with enough wealth to follow and to take the time to vote on a Tuesday and in the middle of in early November, well, they're moving very strongly to the Democratic Party. So I wonder whether enlightened Republicans might stop and say, wait, guys, are we sure we're doing this right? And to what extent does that not matter? It's just a tribal call against the populations in Atlanta and Detroit, in Phoenix and in Milwaukee and Atlanta. And that tribal call, that's just not going to win. I think the Republican Party would be so much better off to go just the other way, to go into Atlanta and say, hey, you're a member of a Black church, vote for us because we agree on lots and lots of issues. And that, that partially happened to Latinx votes, particularly the Latinx votes saved Florida and saved Texas in this last election. And I think particularly young Republicans who don't want much to do with their grandparents' party and all this stuff about squeezing down the vote, I think they should just push back and say, no, we want those low propensity voters because, hey, we could win them. And a Republican Party that really made that part of a coalition would be a new Republican Party. It would make my book completely out of date, alas, but it would make the democracy much stronger. So I'm willing to trade that off. Have to write a new chapter, but that would be just great news. So anyway, I'm beating that point, but
it's big of you to be willing to say.
yeah, I think so.
Well, Jim, I loved your book, but allow me to nitpick a little bit.
Oh no, I knew that was coming.
I'll just pull a sentence out of nowhere. That's the way to nitpick, of course. But you wrote that bipartisan consensus didn't work for the founders, and it doesn't work today. And it seemed to me that using the word consensus kind of stacked the deck a little bit against bipartisanship.
And so here for the listeners is going to be the fireworks between Rich and me, because Rich has, as I said, a very thoughtful book on the filibuster, which I read in the course of this book, just saying, look, we need action across the aisle. So let me be clear and let me get you out of your nitpick by making the statement stronger. Bipartisanship is a myth. Everybody but Rich, who has good arguments, get over it. It's not going to work. It doesn't work. It is the greatest mythology of American history. Let me say a couple of things about this, because in the last chapter, I didn't mean to stack the deck. I meant to say, and this goes throughout the book, you go look for bipartisanship. You will not find it. Now, there are times when the parties are kind of divided in such a way, but first of all, the great presidents, FDR, Ronald Reagan, they didn't send an olive branch to the other party. FDR famously, Hoover is like, help me out. There's months. You don't take over till March. We're in the middle of this depression. Let's work together. And FDR said, no, thank you. Go away. If we go deeper into depression, that's all right. I'm not linking hands with you. I've got something new I want to try. And if you were a Republican, you had a choice. You had a choice, either sign up to the New Deal or shut up, because anything else you were going to lose. Dwight Eisenhower was the first Republican president after the New Deal. His brother said, well, you got to roll back Social Security. That was the big Democratic, as big government. Eisenhower wrote him a bitter letter saying any party that tries to abolish Social Security will not exist much longer, will be defeated at the polls forever. And he just looked like a Democrat. FDR won. He didn't win over anybody. Ronald Reagan the same way. He had just had parties at the White House for any time a Democrat said, okay, I'm coming over and turning into a Republican. People who are for bipartisan, it sounds good. Americans don't like all this conflict. But let me give you the golden shining moment of bipartisanship. The golden shining moment, which I'm about to explode. You've really touched a nerve here, Rich.
Yeah.
The golden shining moment comes in 1948 when a famous senator from Michigan, very conservative guy, says politics stops at the water's edge. He was making the point that during the Cold War, the Democrats and the Republicans had to work together to show a united front. And every pundit and every op-ed writer says, oh, if only politics stopped at the water's edge. Well, I invite all of you, first you could read my chapter, but if you don't believe me, just go back and read the newspapers from 1946, 47, 48. And what you'll find is, yes, indeed, there are conservative Republicans in the North and conservative Democrats in the South, bipartisan, and they run a Red Scare. They run McCarthyism. Between 1946 and 1952, we have the worst Red Scare in American history. If you were too far to the left, you were destroyed. You weren't just defeated, you were destroyed. You were driven out of politics. You lost your job. That Red Scare was at the very moment that everybody talks about the kumbaya moment. It wasn't no kumbaya moment. And anybody's a lefty out there, thank your lucky stars that you weren't around in 1950, because they would have crushed you. Now, was it bipartisan? Yeah, it was bipartisan. The conservative Southern Democrats, and you know, the House Un-Americans committee that was rounding people up, that's where they discovered that Republicans and Democrats could work so well together. There was this Texan and Republican, there's a Democrat from Texas running the committee, but he found that the Republicans, like a Republican from New Jersey, they hated the Reds as much as he did. And they thought, hey, these Republicans, we can work with them. So it looks bipartisan on the surface, but it was vicious. So I just want to say, this dream of bipartisan, you give me the year, and I will tell you how the partisanship operated. I remember when Obama came in, one of my glory moments was in 2008-9, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and I said, please, Barack, don't try this bipartisanship thing. You'll get kicked in the teeth. And I got it in the New York Times. You know, once in a while, they'll run something. And the last 10 things I tried to run, they said no, but that one they ran. And I got denounced right and left. It was great. You know, nothing better than you write an op-ed and everybody denounces you. Yeah. But I just think it was accurate. And so I would say one of the greatest mirages in American politics is this dream of bipartisanship. And you go back generation after generation, and you just see how much they fought. Bipartisanship is for a losing party. They reach out and they try to hang on. The Democrats hanging on as Reagan rises. All of a sudden, they discover that they can work with the Republicans. Yeah, they can, because they're scared to death. Reagan will stomp them. Indeed, he did 49 states. Or Republicans hanging on during the FDR administration. So I'm overstating the point, of course, a little bit. It's not that there's never times you can work together, but the dream that will really get important policy, tends not to come from bipartisanship. Now, there are clear exceptions. The Civil Rights Act is a great exception. The Voting Rights Act is a great exception, saved by the Republicans and joined with the Democrats. So I'm not saying there are not exceptions, but there are very few periods in American history where you do get genuine progress with bipartisanship. Indeed, if you want to look at the great programs that we live with today, my cat is back, telling me to calm down, take a deep breath. That's what cats do. You know, if you just look at the great programs in American history, they were all passed in very brief periods. The Republicans between 1860 and 1862 passed almost all the major programs, whether it's the Homestead Act or the Agricultural Department, or all kinds of programs, because the conservative Democrats had withdrawn from Congress. Likewise, the period between 1933 and 1936, Social Security, welfare, of all the farm programs, the maternal and child welfare programs, unemployment assistance, all came in that brief year when the Democrats had a vast majority, that brief period. And likewise, voting rights, civil rights, immigration reform, Medicare, Medicaid, secondary aid to secondary education, Head Start, all of that, war on poverty, all of that comes from the period between 1964 and 1966. So you go through the federal budget, just go through the whole federal budget and cross out anything that's passed between 34 and 36 and 64 and 66 and 1862 and 1864, and you're going to find nothing but chump change, which is to say, when one party completely ruled, you got lots of programs. Now I'm talking like a liberal Democrat, the kinds of stuff I like. But the same thing you'll find happens generally with Republicans. They got their stuff through, not always, but by and large, when they had either large majorities or a combination of conservative Southerners, Democrats and Northerners. So one of the myths, I have a bunch of myths in my book, and there's something to offend everybody, but one that draws a lot of fire is the one Rich just described. And I think maybe, Rich, you and I will just remain friends by agreeing to disagree on that one.
Sure.
So let me just put, I know most of you would sort of by inclination, being good, educated, Brown related folks would like, bipartisanship would be great. But my view, it's as a mirage. Rich says, pay attention to the exceptions, and let's just let you all decide for yourselves. But I defy you to read my book and come away being optimistic about bipartisanship.
Yeah, well, there's a difference between thinking it's an important goal and being optimistic about it.
Yeah, and I guess, yes, let's that's a good way to make a compromise on that position. And if anybody wants to carry forth the debate, I've had my say on that one. But I always say to the Democratic administrations, particularly now, you're not going to get it. So if you can, great. And who knows, maybe Biden will prove me wrong. You think you make a generalization based on history, and then it just explodes. Like saying that, hey, Republicans have no way they're going to lose those two Georgia Senate seats. So you could be wrong. History does not really repeat itself.
Maybe these things look a little bit different from inside a legislative body. And that may explain why I see it very differently. It may explain why Joe Biden sees it very differently.
He is a citizen of your Senate, the Senate where people, the legacy of people. It'll be really interesting. I can't imagine a better test of our debate, Rich, than having Joe Biden there, being forced to go to the middle a little bit by at least one Democrat, Senator Manchin, and a man who would agree to the death with Rich's position that bipartisanship is a great value. And so, I think we couldn't have a better test today, that if you find that Biden is able to do, say, an infrastructure bill where he really can get Republicans on board, and enough Republicans on board, that'll be a suggestion that someone who really knows the Washington system can actually make it happen. As I look at American history, one of the things that really impresses me, and I know I'm talking to an audience that is about equally divided between Bernie Sanders supporters and Elizabeth Warren supporters. I myself was an Elizabeth Warren supporter, but I am really a believer in people who know the Washington system. You wouldn't elect a president of Brown who didn't know anything about education. So much as I've loved many of the people who were elected president, you go back and read about Lyndon Baines Johnson. He just knew how to operate that machinery.
Right.
And the difficulty that both Obama had and Trump really had was they didn't know the machinery.
Right.
And Biden will know the machinery. So that is a really important.
And I would add Jimmy Carter, who was almost a classic example of that.
Yes. Yeah. He comes into office, Jimmy Carter, and immediately the Senate, the House chair of the Ways and Means Committee says, I'm going to need some extra tickets for the inauguration. And he goes, no special privileges. I'm not saying become a politician and hand out jobs, but tickets to the inauguration.
Yeah. And the very next thing he did was cancel all of these big water projects
that people were so proud to bring home. Well, now you and I are talking about old balls. Right. Which what have you done to me?
Yeah. Hang
on one second.
We need to turn to.
Yeah, I'm in. Sorry, I can hear you.
Okay, you're back. That was a good segue because we now can turn to questions from the audience.
Or should we? Do you have a list or?
Yeah, I do. The very first question comes from Georgina, and she asks, "What's the cat's name?"
Hi, Georgina. Very important question. That is Sand. Named by a young man of 6 years old, Sand and Moon, and they know when the Zoom camera is on. So my students are used to seeing Sand. So yeah, that's Sand. She is a chow hound. You might have seen that she's a bit overweight.
Tim asks, would you not agree that the situation today with Hispanics, Latinx is more complicated as of 2020? Trump did well with some Latinos and badly with others. Can we assume that more Latinos, especially men, will not move toward the Republicans?
That's a really good question, Tim. And you're exactly right. The 2020 election, the big question is, what does it mean? And Democrats are all chewing their fingernails about what the 2020 election means. Remember what I said? Things are always changing. If you just sit back and expect the voters to stick with you and do nothing for them, you're going to lose. The reason the Republicans lost the African-American vote in 1932 and then 1936 is they took them for granted. In 1932, when 9 out of 10 African-Americans were living below the poverty line, the platform for the Republican Party said, we will continue to support all the gains that African-Americans have made, past perfect tense. Well, they lost them. Why did the Latino votes, particularly Latino votes, move towards the Republican as it a beginning of a trend? First of all, we have to say it's still 2-1. Over 60% of Latino voters voted, Latinx voters voted for the Democrats. I think it's 63, 64%. But it also has to be said, very sharp movement towards the Republicans. And that's not just true in Texas and Florida. It's true particularly, as Rich said, among males right across the country. Two possibilities, at least two possibilities. One is in Florida. If you read the book, the first campaign book that came out, one of the stories in it, it's called Lucky. It's not a very good book, but it's called Lucky. And one of the interesting things in it was that the Latino organizers in Florida and in Texas, but particularly in Florida, were screaming at the Biden campaign, you've got to do the shoe leather. You got to come here. Send us your organizers. And the Democrats thought, we have a message about COVID, and that message is COVID is dangerous. So we are not going to go to door. And everywhere, African-American and Latino organizers told them, this is the way you get our constituencies out. You don't Zoom. And the Trump people they hit the ground big time. And they did it in 2018 in Florida. And so even though there's a great trend towards Democrats in 2018, they won big in Florida. And they did it again in 2020. And both times, Democrats failed to do it, with one exception. Stacey Abrams in Georgia. She didn't play by the playbook. And look what happened. So one explanation, the Democrats maybe it's a one-off explanation, is they just didn't go in there and compete. There's another explanation. The second explanation is many voters are low information voters. They got difficult, they've got busy lives, they've got real lives. Unlike Rich and me and a lot of the people listening, we spend all our time reading the New York Times at 5:38 and we're all talking about the election. Most people like to have lives and they don't pay much attention to the election. They don't really have this. We know conservative Republican, liberal Democrat, but the thing is, not everybody does. What Trump did with his megaphone, put all the race, sex, immigration, nativism stuff aside, he got the message across that if you're a conservative and you're voting for Democrats, you're an idiot. And in a way, a lot of Latinx voters are genuinely conservative on social issues and liberal on economic issues. Same is true with African-American voters, particularly men. Liberal on economic issues, very conservative on social issues. And Trump looked at them and screamed, you're with me. You are conservative the same way I'm conservative. What did the Democrats say? They said nothing. They did go all in on Black Lives Matter to some extent, but there's Biden kind of in the basement. You know, I'm not for defunding the police. No, I never said that. So very negative, like, no, we have to have police justice. Great, I agree with that. But I'm not for defunding the police. That's not a very strong statement. So you don't blame a lot of social conservative people in all kinds of community, white, Latinx, Asian, Black, from hearing Trump's message and saying, gee, he's saying stuff that actually resonates with me. This is a huge wake-up call for Democrats. First, you've got to make the case. You take any group for granted, you will lose that group. And so is this a blip up that'll go back down? Possibly, but it's up to how the Democrats and Republicans play it. If it's at the beginning of a long-term trend that's really different, again, depends how Republicans and Democrats play it. If the Republicans stick with Trump and stick with the sort of racial antagonism and nativism, I think there's probably a ceiling on how they do with constituencies like Latino constituencies. If the party says, wait a minute, there's gold in them hills for us, we really ought to begin to think not just about rural whites. We've mined that mine. Let's really try to put together a platform that begins to speak to African Americans, the conservative churchgoers. And if the Democrats continue to take them for granted, Tim, you are right. This could be a long-term trend. But the future is really up for grabs in both parties in a way I have not seen in my lifetime. Both parties up for grabs right now. And that's really interesting. I mean, you're a political junkie, don't particularly care about the fate of the democracy. Hey, couldn't it be a better time?
I'm wondering, do you think the 2020 election hinged on the pandemic?
Yes, for sure. I do believe, given how close it was, Trump, it's hard to believe he didn't lose just those few votes in those few states. Now, that raises another problem, and that is we've never had a situation. People always say, well, there have been minority presidents elected with a minority of the electoral vote, but those were really exceptional cases. I mean, Andrew Jackson lost the election, but he came roaring back the next election. And Grover Cleveland lost in one of those incredible, both candidates got under 50%, but he came roaring back came slipping back in the next election. And Rutherford B. Hayes lost and then won. But that was a very anomalous case. And the Democrats soon took over. He won in 76. Grover Cleveland would win, and the Democrats would win it all within a decade. So it's not like the bias in the Constitution became baked into our electoral game. It is really dangerous that starting in 2000, that bias got baked in. I mean, the idea that someone won by almost 7 million votes and still barely scraped by, that's really bad news. And don't go thinking that this is something that the Constitution set up. There is no precedent for one party having a deep bias, a deep advantage in the House, Senate, and Electoral College, because there's no real precedent for one party ruling in rural America and another party ruling in the cities. That's an unprecedented situation, but I have to say, the idea of minority governance is something we have never sustained for very long, with one great exception. The slave states dominated, thanks to the 3/5 rule, during the first part of the Republic. That wasn't urban rural, that was the bias in the slave states. That is a terrible precedent. And that's the only precedent of constant minority rule across the country. And even there, it was never the kind of bias. 7 million votes and winning by 70,000, less than 70 was 50,000 scattered votes. That's a dangerous situation where we just accept the fact that the winner can be the loser election after election. The idea that Republicans have won one presidential popular vote since 1988 and still are so much in the running, that's not good. It's not good for Republicans and it's not good for Democrats. And Republicans can't continue to rely on that because the system won't hold. We'll break our democracy, I think. We'll break our Constitution that way.
This question comes from Angela Rudner, who says, hi, Dr. Morone.
Hey, Angela.
I graduated in 1984 and majored in political science and had the joy of taking many of your classes.
You took the classes the first time I taught them. I wish you hadn't outed us on how long, but you were taking the classes the very first time I taught them. Wow, I hope you're thriving.
She says, I feel like Americans are living in two parallel universes, and we're in danger of no longer being a representative democracy. The events of January 6th felt traumatic, and all of the news media seems to exacerbate our divisions. What do you think each of us can do to create more civility and positive democratic discourse in our country?
You know, that is so true. Of course, Brown graduate, took my courses. That's a great question. You know, when I was writing the book, my dad was a Republican. He voted Republican every election in his life, except once when he was in the Army in 1944. He voted for Tom Dewey, who was running for president against Franklin Roosevelt, the fourth Roosevelt term, and the colonel called him in, and he looks at him and he goes, Morone, waving his absentee ballot, you're the only man in this unit to vote against the commander-in-chief. He ripped up his ballot, saying, you get your ass back in that tent and you vote for the commander-in-chief and do it right. And my father, for the first time and only time in his life, voted for a Democrat. So when I'm writing, I always think of my father, and I just think he wouldn't have liked Trump. He would have been really upset, but he just couldn't go all the way to being a Democrat. And I think what we can all do to lower the temperature is to make friends with people on the other side of the aisle, and just agree to disagree, meet them and talk to them. I have this experience with my Republican students. You know, I had just one Republican student in a seminar, 19 avid Democrats. He came to class as a veteran, a good guy. And he came to class with a Trump 2020 shirt. All hell broke loose, seminar. And I said, okay, let's just cool down the temperature. Tell us why. I want each of you to tell us why you believe what you believe, but don't say the word Trump. Just say what your values are, that he and on the other side, it was still the people you are supporting in the Democratic primaries, what the values are under them. And he gave a really eloquent agreement. He said, and by the end of the class, he was saying, I hate all that racial rhetoric. And you know, I was in the Army. I had lots of commanders who were different colors, different gender than me. I had women commanders and they yelled, jump, I jumped. Yeah, that's how the Army was. And I came out of the Army, it seemed like everyone for himself. And I went to a Trump rally and I was part of a community. I felt like I was back in the military. And the Democrats in the class thought, oh, well, we agree with that part. You know, the idea of a tight bond, we agree with that. That's what we're looking for. At bottom, the Trump supporter and the Bernie supporters thought they saw the same values in what, and the Trump supporter was perfectly willing to apologize for the racial stuff. And I just thought, boy, if everybody could get into a room like this, and they went out together, sort of eagerly talking with one another, and they, you know, just put aside the proper names and have that conversation. And the other thing we can do is really, really fight to make sure everyone votes. That's the toxic part. If you just say, I don't care who you're voting for, I just want to give you the right to vote. And let's really fight that fight, because I think that's the other way. I just believe that if we have very large turnout, that both parties will start having to speak to whole new constituencies. So we really need to talk across the aisle. So I'm contradicting what I said earlier about bipartisanship, although it's not really a contradiction. And we can do that if we just say no proper names, please. Don't mention any names. You don't mention Pelosi. I won't mention Trump. And God, we're not going to marry with that Taylor woman. We're just one congressman. I don't mention that. No AOC. Let's talk about the values. So have that conversation and fight for the right to vote.
Great. Leslie asks, any recourse to the restrictive voting laws passed in Georgia and Iowa, et cetera?
Yes. Let's see. Here's a place where the Democrats have a shot to really sit down with the Republicans. So here's a test of Richard's principle. We can have federal laws. And so this is going to be a battle, not just on the state level, but on the federal level. As Stacey Abrams has shown us how to fight it on the state level. And, you know, these laws sometimes really backfire. People get pissed off, particularly suburban people. So what you do when there are restrictive laws is you create massive turnouts on the back of those laws. You just say, this is an assault on democracy. So that's one thing on the ground. Democrats have been pretty crummy about organizing on the ground. Beto O'Rourke showed that in Texas. He just went everywhere in Texas and almost won. And I think if he would have been running this time, he might have won. And on the other side, Democrats and Republicans ought to sit down in the Senate and just say, where can we agree about really protecting the right to vote? And let's see if we can get a majority of people. It's a pipe dream, but if Rich is right and there's hope in bipartisanship, it ought to be hope in the idea that people have a right to vote. We can, the whole voter fraud thing is a great myth, but we can do voter fraud stuff and still expand the right to vote. So that's the two forms of recourse. Organize, and don't underestimate how powerful that is. Democrats lose when they don't go after their voters and knock on their doors. And then let's see what can be done in Washington on the presidential level. If against all odds, the Democrats win in the Senate at the midterm, then a Voting Rights Act, then they could actually decide, okay, we couldn't do it with Republicans. I throw Rich under the bus and I say, we now have a couple of votes that don't rely on a guy from West Virginia. let's go after voting rights. Let's really pursue voting rights. So there's lots of avenues for this, but organize voting rights at the federal level. Those are the two.
I'm halfway under the bus already.
Yes, yes.
Maria asks, you mentioned that maybe the US should borrow compulsory voting from countries like Australia and Brazil. Should we also consider their multi-party system? Is that even possible?
No, that's alas. Love Brazil. Grew up in Brazil. There was a at the 200th anniversary of the Constitution, there was a vote among historians. If there was one clause you could throw out of the U.S. Constitution, what would it be? And they took a minor clause no one ever notices, which says you may not be a member of the executive and a member of Congress at the same time. That was one of a number of things that solidified us into a two-party system. No, the Constitution essentially, even though it's against parties, makes it very, very difficult to have a multi-party system. But if you want to push for it, and I do think it would be a good idea, if you want to push for it, ranked choice voting in the states, slowly but surely, would be a way to start trying to push for that. The combination of the way our Constitution sets up elections and what we call first past the post congressional elections, meaning that whoever wins the plurality, even if they win by 50.1%, wins the seat, means it's almost impossible to create a multi-party system. So alas, there is no example of even a successful third party in the United States. There's never been one. There's never been one that's lasted. So I'm for it. I wish it could happen. It's not going to happen, at least not anytime soon. So great question, and it's an important one, but the Constitution and the whole way we've set up our system makes it impossible. If the system explodes and we start looking for a new way to do things, maybe, but that's the future.
Well, I'd like to be able to keep doing this all night, but maybe we can squeeze one last question.
Yeah, let's do one last question. I'll keep it short.
Even those with the most, this is from Amal.
Hey, Amal.
Even those with the most remedial grasp of history understand that those who make that first concession to the despot don't buy themselves gratitude, they buy themselves ever escalating servitude. And now not only do educated, experienced politicians subject themselves to this cycle, but an entire party apparatus does. How do they fail to see the cliff they're racing towards? What can make them pump the brakes before they plummet?
Oh, I couldn't put it better than you did, Amal. That is so eloquently put, and it is really frightening. I've said that both parties are up for grabs in a way I haven't seen in my lifetime. Who are the Democrats? For the first time in their entire history, they appear on the verge of losing the working class. And that's a huge problem for Democrats and Republicans riding this tiger, and who eats, as you said, you put it more eloquently than me, and your metaphors are better than me. It is really dangerous. It never occurred to me the whole time I've been studying politics, and one of our early questioners outed me for how long I've been in this business, but I've never seen a period where I've worried more about the demise of the republic. It really, the idea of taking someone who will not accept an election and pandering to them, knowing full well he lost the election, and pandering to him, is really dancing on the edge of a cliff. And so we really are reliant on Democrats to be bold, to be brave, to really go after their constituents, and for Republicans, particularly young Republicans, to start a revolution in the ranks of the Republican Party and say, no, this is not the party we signed up for. It's a party of principle, of freedom, of liberty, of markets. It's not a party of despotism. But a lot of people have decided that keeping their seats, keeping their positions, means trying to dance with the devil. And not dance with the devil, sign the souls with the devil. And that, as you said so beautifully in that question, that never works. The devil always wins.
Well, with that warning about the devil, Jim, I want to thank you so much for really a great evening, some real insight. And one of the frustrating things about Zoom is that we can't hear the vigorous applause from the audience
I
that
can
I
hear
know
it.
is out there.
Well, thank you so much. It was really fun to talk to you, Rich, specifically. We were old friends. We've known each other, I think, since the day Rich set foot on campus. It's just a real pleasure to have this chat with you, and also with all the people who asked questions or didn't. You probably know my email. It's so if you didn't get a question answered, just feel free to email me, and we'll continue the conversation. Just continue the conversation by email. And if there are any of my current students there, I know a few of you signed up from what Sam Griffin told me. Big hi to you guys. Thanks again, Rich. What a pleasure this was for me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.